Hola amigos, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Soy Plácido Doménech. Gracias por estar ahí, gracias por acompañarme. Además, en un sábado con tantísimo calor, hace muchísimo calor. Yo espero después del programa irme a la playa. Pero la verdad es que me estoy aficionando a ver contenido con vosotros porque es verdad que quería ver varias cosas. El programa de ayer que hicimos sobre si vivimos en una simulación creada por una inteligencia artificial, donde analizamos la ponencia o la charla de Philip K. Dick en Metz, deja efectos secundarios, ¿no? Deja señales, deja un eco que nos hace recordar, no sé el qué. Y esta mañana me he levantado y he seguido leyendo este libro, que recomiendo también, que es Pensar la ciencia, los contornos de una nueva visión científica del mundo, por el gran Bernardo Castro. Os recomiendo tanto el libro como a la figura de Bernardo Kastrup, a ver si ponemos algún vídeo de él. Y nada, normalmente suelo leer varios libros a la vez y a veces paro, continúo, y hoy he continuado en el capítulo 17 y hablaba, bueno, de captar las implicaciones de la mecánica cuántica. Bueno, hablaba de la mecánica cuántica, de varias cosas. Y a medida que iba leyendo se mezclaba lo que vimos ayer más lo que dice Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo Kastrup. Y se mezclaba con lo que dijimos ayer y con dos vídeos que tenía pendientes para hacer. Y yo digo, pues, esto es una señal, vamos a hacerlos ya. Uno era una charla con David Deustch, hace muy poquito tiempo, muy cortita, no lleva 10 minutos. Y luego otra más larga del canal Close to Truth, que hablaba de, esa es más larga, de una media hora, no llega, de si la conciencia es la realidad última. Conclusión, en mi cabeza, con el calor, ¡puf! Ya tenemos programa. Nos han canalizado el programa. Así que vamos a por ello. Venga, vamos a hacerlo ágil. Pues quien no la haya visto, como comentábamos ayer, viernes a las 10, estrenamos horario. Bueno, la verdad es que este programa lo requería, ¿no? Estar como en un estado, bueno, estar fresquito y en un estado alterado de conciencia. No, un poco más de noche. A las 10 lo hicimos. Vivimos en una simulación creada por una inteligencia artificial. No os lo perdáis, ¿eh? No os lo perdáis. El Instagram, el vídeo que nos pasó ahí Héctor Fernández La Z, yo ya lo había visto, pero bueno, hace años, pero tenéis que verlo, tenéis que verlo. Y bueno, estamos en el quinto verano, en el quinto xHUB.AI, en xHUB.AI. Es un programa, el de que estáis viendo, de la comunidad de Inteligencia Artificial y Ciencias transversales de habla hispana. Quinta temporada de éxito. Bueno, he visto hoy la entrevista de la que está todo el mundo hablando. Y ya nos copian hasta lo de la comunidad, frases. Este hombre nos tendría que pagar royalties por guiones, temas. Ay, señor. Me voy a callar, venga. Quinta temporada de xHUB.AI. De gran éxito, no vamos a parar en julio y en agosto, excepto una semana, ya os lo comentaré, que tengo que preparar cosas. Este programa está emitiéndose por X, YouTube, LinkedIn, Rumble, Kik y Twitch. Ya sabéis que ni Meta ya no vamos a darle soporte ni a su CEO, ni a su compañía, ni a Facebook, ni a Instagram. Y bueno, tengo WhatsApp porque bueno, y alguna cosa publico en Instagram, casi todo de tema político. ¿Qué entrevista es esa, Plácido? La que vamos a ver ahora, la de David Deustch, Eduardo. Sí, es una entrevista, bueno, es un fragmento, entiendo que es una entrevista sobre interpretación cuántica. Y luego, después de ese trocito, es que no sé si poner antes... la idea era poner antes la de Closer to... no, vamos a poner primero la de David Deustch. Vamos a hacerlo al revés. Primero la de David Deustch, que es más cortita, y luego vamos a poner la de Close to Truth, sobre la conciencia como realidad última. ¿De acuerdo? Sí, ahora de todas formas os pongo a la que te referías. ¡Ah! Ya. Uf. Mira, venga, voy a leer un fragmento. Bueno, no, sé que no le va a importar. Ahora mismo está diciendo, ¿has visto esto? Bueno, no voy a decir quién me lo ha pasado, está leyéndolo por Discord. Y me pone, estoy hasta mareado. He tenido que dejarlo en el minuto 22. Cuando recupere fuerzas seguiré. No puedo creérmelo. nunca tienen ninguna responsabilidad. Bueno, no voy a decir quién me lo dice. Y sí, te lo digo por privado, Eduardo. Te lo digo la entrevista por privado, cuál es. No sé, el miércoles vamos a hacer un programa que se va a llamar Europa.AI medieval o Europa.AI de Hamelin. Yo es que no quiero que esto se convierta en una guerra, pero hay una orquestación. Yo voy a dejar ahí. Con unos grandes intereses porque todo continúe igual y no se mire más allá en ciertos aspectos, que es lo que hacemos nosotros. Y me callo tanto lo que opino de esa entrevista como lo que opino de la entrevistada, del entrevistador, del canal. Y bueno, tampoco pasa nada. Cada uno que haga lo que quiera. Pero bueno, en este caso sí que tengo algo que decir. Pero vamos, es más de lo mismo, en definitiva. Vale, vamos a seguir. Bueno, como comentamos, a ver si podemos hacer crecer xHUB.AI. Estoy teniendo varias reuniones al respecto. Ayer tuve una. La semana que viene tendré otra. La idea es hacer xHUB.AI que sea una plataforma independiente. A ver si podemos conseguirlo. Calidad y cantidad. Porque esta era y este nuevo paradigma de la inteligencia artificial tan transversal, la verdad es que requiere muchísimo tiempo, hay tantísimos temas, hay un montón de papers sobre agentes, no da la vida ni para leer, bueno, leer, divulgar, pensar, desarrollar, aprender, bueno, es una auténtica locura, luego ganar pasta, claro, obvio. No vivimos del aire. Bueno, si os gusta el contenido que vamos a ver, compartid, comentad o suscribíos al canal de YouTube. Importante, interesante, pues que comentéis qué os parece. Si queréis uniros al Discord de la comunidad de xHUB.AI, envíanos un mensaje directo o correo para integraros en la comunidad de Discord. Que por cierto, sé que en la comunidad de Discord tenemos, a ver, gente al enemigo. A ver, no hace falta que me lo digáis. A ver, eso ya lo sé. Por cierto, esto no es nada raro, ¿eh? Es agua con limón. Yo no sé muy bien, no soy de alcohol. Mucho una buena cerveza. Porque hace mucho calor y la verdad es que algo fresquito sí que ayuda. Y bueno, sé que en el Discord hay gente que, bueno, está ahí para sacar todo lo que puede y ya está. Y estar viendo lo que decimos, lo que no, me da absolutamente igual. Me conocen poco, ¿eh? Primero, por creerse más listos que yo, porque a mí no me gusta tampoco jugar a ese juego, mi línea es otra, pero entiendo que eso va a ocurrir. Y segundo, por creer que no lo sé. Vamos, el mundo es muy pequeño. También es verdad que si lo detecto, vamos, a mí pocas tonterías. A mí me cuesta poco bloquear a alguien o simplemente... A ver, esto es serio, chicos. A ver, es que tampoco quiero que nos centremos en el tema y no quiero desviarlo. Si os ha gustado lo que habéis visto, podéis apoyar económicamente el canal y comunidad para poder seguir disfrutando de este tipo de contenidos. Podéis apoyarlo a través de Buy Me a Coffee o a través de PayPal, ¿vale? Recibimos muy poquito apoyo porque sé que tenéis que gastaroslo en vacaciones. Pero la verdad es que julio y agosto, que vamos a estar haciendo contenidos a tutiplay, y ya no solo el tema de los contenidos, el tema de las charlas igual. A ver, hay algunas, voy a grabar 2 o 3 charlas, la de, evidentemente, la inversión racional, quizá la más importante, pero se hacen principalmente para que tenga difusión tanto xHUB.AI como esa visión de futuro, de progreso, disruptiva, que no significa ir contra todo, pero es tener la mente abierta a un mundo nuevo y a paradigmas nuevos, ¿no? Y a escuchar y a no dogmatizar a tantas y tantas cosas, ¿no? También podéis hacerlo a través de un superchat en YouTube o pronto en Patreon. Hoy no me da tiempo. Rápidamente, el 16 en Alicante, en puntapiedra, podéis asistir gratuitamente a mi charla de 11 a 2 en Agentic.AI, reinventando los negocios con inteligencia, un tema evidentemente de actualidad, pero también polémico. Está generándose un debate como todo lo que rodea a la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? Un evento que organiza xHUB.AI con la Cámara de Comercio de Alicante. Y bueno, la semana que viene, el 11, el viernes, ponéis una vela o unas oraciones ahí. No, a ver, no hace falta, pero siempre es algo muy bonito. Yo siempre he dicho que alguien que reza por ti o pide por ti es en silencio, ¿no? Además, somos energía, ¿no? Todo está ahí, ¿no? Y somos intención. La energía, esto es muy repetido, ¿no? Y yo creo que funciona, ¿no? Es esa magia invisible. Y nada, la ronda 2, ya me han pasado un poco de que vamos a estar hablando y tal, y va a ser... esa charla sí que va a estar bien. A veces... cuando me ponen esas... A ver, bueno, la primera la verdad es que fue más... no, bueno, sí que tuve conciencia, fue consciente de la importancia, ¿no? Pero luego no era consciente tampoco de la gran difusión que iba a tener, ¿no? Pero entiendo el papel que debo jugar para liderar una determinada visión, ¿no? Yo y muchos más, evidentemente. Y sí, es importante, yo me lo tomo muy en serio, es importante, es un momento trascendente y yo creo que tiene que venir un cambio y el cambio viene provocado por una toma de conciencia, por una voluntad de dejar de ser ciego y de ponerse manos a la obra, ¿no? Una llamada a la lucha, a la guerra en el buen sentido. Y va a ser complicado, ¿no? Entonces, cuando voy a ese tipo de entrevistas que además lo hacen francamente bien, es una responsabilidad, pero voy a decir lo que pienso y luego cada cual, pues ya me diréis vuestras opiniones. La verdad es que voy a decir lo que pienso igual, pero bueno, es interesante siempre. Lo importante no es la cantidad de gente que pueda verse impactada, sino si a lo mejor impacta en una o dos, quizá como el efecto de las alas de mariposa pueda hacer que cambie el mundo, ¿no? O creemos entre todos un mundo mejor. Pero bueno, no me enrollo más. Vamos, he cortado una parte de los programas nuevos. No es mañana si... Mañana haremos programas seguramente, si no pasa nada. No sé cuándo ni a qué hora. Normalmente el mediodía, porque luego hago otra cosa y ya está. Es como un tiempo muerto que en vez de descansar, pues estoy aquí con vosotros. Pero bueno, que a veces hemos hecho 2 programas. Ricardo País. Buen día, recién me estoy viendo el capítulo de ayer. Lo veo muy relacionado con una pregunta de hace un par de capítulos. Muchas gracias por el contenido. Gracias, Ricardo. Vamos a ver, estaba pensando el orden. Vamos a ver primero a David Deustch, que es más cortito, y luego veremos ese vídeo de Close to Truth sobre la reflexión si la conciencia es esa realidad última, ¿vale? Entonces vamos a dejarme un segundín que la busque. Bueno, voy a estar, pues eso, también muy pendiente del chat, de lo que digáis. Venga, vamos a por la primera charla. Bueno, David Deustch, que si no lo conocéis, La fábrica de la realidad, ese libro que es el que prácticamente proporciona o origina la serie Devs de Alex Garland, serie de HBO que es una de mis favoritas y que tenéis que ver sí o sí. Vale, un segundo que active los subtítulos y empezamos ya. Vale, ya lo tenemos. Vamos a por ello. Del canal de Institute of Art and Ideas, 20 minutitos de uno de mis referentes, David Deustch, creador también de la computación cuántica, fue el inventor, el creador, es él.
We can spend that time improving our knowledge, or we can spend... however long we last, we can spend that time improving our knowledge, or we can spend it not doing so. We can spend it destroying our knowledge. We have free will.
I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Deutsch, a physicist at the University of Oxford, often described as the father of quantum computing. He's the author of several books, including The Beginning of Infinity and The Fabric of Reality. David Deutsch, welcome to II Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you've said in previous interviews, specifically one with Alex O'Connor, regarding the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics, that, quote, to do proper science, you have to be a realist, unquote. Could you outline what you mean by this specifically?
Yes, traditionally science was just straightforwardly understood, and I think this is the only reasonable thing to do, as being a project of understanding the world, understanding what is there, how it behaves, crucially, what is there that's not visible, not perceptible, but still affects the things that are visible and perceptible. But in the 20th century, for various bad philosophical reasons, people started to question that, and they said things like they tried to champion ideas like that the world doesn't really exist, or that, I mean the physical world, or that if it does exist, we can't have any knowledge of it, or that we are only playing with words, or that there isn't a difference between a truer theory and a less true theory, and so on. And those are all dead ends. They all are promoting an agenda of not understanding the world, not of understanding it better by realizing that we're only talking about words and that kind of thing, but an agenda of not understanding anything, which isn't worth having.
And you use the phrase bad philosophical reasons there. When you say that, are you saying more than just people being wrong-headed? Are you saying that there was some malign motivation behind that? And what would you say that is?
Not malign. I'm drawing a distinction between philosophy or philosophical theories that are false, like that there's no such thing as infinity or that sort of thing, and philosophies that are bad, which are philosophies that intend to sabotage the debate or to prevent progress in about a particular thing. So I call that bad philosophy. And the 20th century was increasingly filled with the bad philosophy as well as false philosophy. But false is not pejorative. All human knowledge is false. We're always, as Popper said, we're all alike in our infinite ignorance. So there's no shame in being wrong, but there is some sort of shame, even if you do it unintentionally, in trying to short circuit arguments on principle and settling into a fixed, unchanging worldview.
Why would people be wanting to short circuit arguments in principle? Are they trying to achieve certain ends? Is it something that they're unknowingly doing?
So it all comes down to the theory of knowledge, epistemology, that historically people adopted a rather naive theory of knowledge, which is workable. It required fine-tuning at the edges and so on, but gradually in the 18th and especially the 19th century, people started taking seriously that, for example, knowledge comes from our senses, but our senses are fallible. Therefore, there's no such thing as knowledge. That sort of argument. Now, when that was first proposed, people didn't take it seriously. It was just like, oh yeah, we might all be blown up any moment or whatever. And then they just carried on with solving their problems as best they could. But then in the 20th century, people started taking that seriously, and there were philosophies like Wittgenstein and so on who took seriously that there's no such thing as knowledge, including philosophical knowledge. Therefore, this very theory about philosophical knowledge isn't knowledge and should be discarded. Like the ladder, I don't think Wittgenstein actually says where we're sitting when we've thrown away the ladder. We're supposed to be not sitting on anything. Then Karl Popper came along and made a philosophical breakthrough to the effect that we don't need a firm foundation. We don't need certified true knowledge. We only ever have conjecture, but by criticism and experiment, we can remove some of the errors from our conjectures and therefore get closer to the truth.
It sounds there quite strongly that you're arguing that reality is independent of human perception. But how does this align with the idea that our scientific theories are ultimately human constructions, or are they not ultimately human constructions?
You see, this term ultimately gives away the origin of that critique. Yes, they are human constructions, but that doesn't mean that they are false or meaningless just because they're human and humans are fallible. The point is, we only ever have fallible knowledge. We only ever trust propositions that are strictly false, even though they may contain knowledge. So I may take the bus to town and use Newton's laws to if I wanted to do such a thing, maybe it's a bad example, but check that it won't fall through the floor. And Newton's laws are good enough, even though we know they are false. So they contain a vast amount of knowledge, as witness the fact that they are the result of correcting errors in previous theories, which themselves contained knowledge and had corrected previous errors and so on. And sometimes we even go down blind alleys and we have to backtrack and so on. There's never any guarantee, but we can proceed without absolute guarantees.
It seems to be that you're implying that scientific progress is infinite in some respect. Does this imply that we'll never arrive at a true and final understanding of the universe? And if so, how does that align to the commitment of scientific realism?
Yes, well, we definitely can't expect to reach a final truth. And again, as Karl Popper said, if we did find it, we wouldn't know. Because, say, a true scientific theory has infinitely many consequences, and we can't explore them all. We can't even explore a finite fraction of them. So, yes, if we last long enough, then however long we last, we can spend that time improving our knowledge, or we can spend it not doing so. We can spend it destroying our knowledge. We have free will.
I'd just like to put forward or put to you Carlo Rovelli's, what he's written about the nature of reality. He wrote this in Reality is Not What It Seems and subsequent follow-ups. So he said that, quote, the external point of view is a point of view that doesn't exist, and every description of the world is from inside it. So therefore, the externally observed world does not exist. What exists are only internal perspectives on the world, which are partial and reflect one another. What would you say is wrong with that?
Again, by the way, physicists during the 20th century again, but still to this day, are inclined to take this instrumentalist view of what knowledge is or what theories are. So we can't be sure what is outside the world that we have access to, but we can theorize about it. And note that we don't, if that's the criterion of having access, then we don't have access to the interior world either. We don't have access to our own thoughts with that degree of reliability. Dan Dennett points out many cases of experiments on the brain where by performing certain experiments and attaching electrodes to the place in the brain that receives tactile signals, we can not only make people experience things that aren't happening, we can make them remember their own thoughts of a past that never happened. That's because the brain makes up the differences in timings of nerve signals by confabulating what it itself thought. And all memory is like that ultimately. So we have no access to our internal state either. But as I keep saying, we don't need it. We have conjectures and they can be improved, as Dennett's example exactly shows.
Your examples about the mind bring me on to the next sort of topic that I wanted to ask you about, which is consciousness and the computability of it. It sounds like, or at least in the past, that you've implied that consciousness is computable. Some, like Roger Penrose, have argued the opposite, and he's argued that consciousness is non-computational, and he uses Gödel's incompleteness theorem to argue that the mind can see truths that a purely algorithmic system can't derive, and therefore the brain must be using some kind of non-computable process when it comes to consciousness, something beyond what machines can do. What would you say to a view like that?
Yet again, it is using an impossible conception of what knowledge is. So Penrose thinks that when we see a proof of a mathematical theorem, we are touching certainty. We are godlike entities when we're mathematicians. But that's not true. Our mathematical knowledge is conjectural, just like our knowledge of physics. It's even more removed from our senses, because it's not true that the interior of our brains and the interior of our thoughts is more accessible to us than the world we perceive through our senses. Or the world that we perceive through our theories, like the center of the sun. We know lots about the center of the sun, even though no one has ever perceived it, and perhaps no one ever will. So mathematical truths are based on conjecture. What Gödel showed is that there is no firm ground underneath mathematical theories either. There's no way of proving that the standards of proof that we currently use are perfectly rigorous. And there have been cases in history where they have shown not to be rigorous. I think Peano, who was the first to axiomatize the principles of the natural numbers, his first attempt at that was wrong. and it's interesting that he did not say, well, I've axiomatized them, therefore there's nothing to them other than my axioms. No, he said, oh dear, my axioms don't correctly represent the real number, the natural numbers, so I have to change them. So he was grasping, conjecturing for a reality, an abstract reality, just like scientists try to grasp physical reality. So the same epistemology applies to mathematics as it does to science.
I just wanted to ask you how this conception of conjectural knowledge versus reality applies to the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics, as in, is the particle that doesn't collapse, or the collapse of the wave function that doesn't take place, is that now real in separate universes? And can you explain sort of simply to a layman what the reality of that looks like?
Yes, well, I'm always slightly provoked when someone calls that an interpretation of quantum mechanics, because no one says that about the theory of evolution or other theories in physics. We say we have a theory. We're well aware that it might not be perfect, but it is our claim as to what reality is like. It's our best claim as to what reality is like. In quantum mechanics, things have gone wrong thanks to that bad philosophy that I spoke of earlier. And the fact is that there are experiments where one can show that individual quantum particles are strongly affected by something that is never seen. This is quite familiar in physics. Even Newton postulated invisible fields of force, not fields, invisible forces. that operated on the planets, even though one can never see a force, never perceive a force. And then in astronomy, in the early 20th century, we realized that, well, before that, we realized that the stars are things like the sun. They're not dots like they seem in the sky. They are spheres, million kilometers across of incandescent gas and so on. And then we found that our galaxy isn't the only one in the universe. And in quantum mechanics, we discovered that the world we see around us, everyday world we see around us, or in the laboratory, the photon that we see is only one of many that are accompanying it, and they're all imperceptible to us, except in very specially contrived situations where they affect the photon that we do see. So that's Everettian quantum mechanics, I'd rather say, rather than an interpretation. There is only one interpretation, in my view, of quantum mechanics.
In the Everettian quantum mechanics, could you just explain, so what, by what virtue can we talk about the branches, the various branches being different? Do the laws of physics apply differently within those branches?
The laws of physics are the same, and there are also, these laws also talk about interactions between the universes, which in everyday experience are too slight to notice, but in careful experiments one can notice them. And the most amazing one you can do at home with a laser pointer and a card with holes in it, make pinholes in it. You can see that when you pass light through a bunch of holes in the card, it makes a weird pattern, not the same pattern as the holes, a completely different pattern. And there are cases where, if you look carefully, where there are places on the screen, on the wall, where you're shining this, where if you open an additional hole, that place goes dark. And so that's called interference. The photons that would have arrived there have been interfered with. And then interfered with by what? Well, you can also do this not at home, but you'll have to believe me about this part. If you do it with individual photons, going through blip, blip, and then not projected onto a screen, but captured by photomultipliers, which are sensitive enough to detect individual photons, you will see that exactly the same is true for single photons. So what has interfered with them? Well, it doesn't matter what we call it, but whatever it is obeys the same equations as photons. You can reflect it off mirrors. You can slow it down with glass, and it behaves exactly like a photon that we do see. And what's more, the equations describing it say that that's what it will do. And so that's the prototype argument by which we build up into saying that actually the whole world is like that.
I just want to ask you one final question, which is that you're taking part in a panel with Lee Smolin and Amanda Gefter on the scientific and philosophical nature of nothing. What is the main point that you'd like to get across?
I just want to say that this kind of issue, when I'm speaking about nothing, am I really speaking about anything? That sort of question is unfair when the question has arisen honestly. So when the question arises honestly, not just as a philosophical plaything, which is then a word game, and then it's criticized for being a word game, but people really do want to know things like, if the universe began at the Big Bang, what happened before? Was there anything before? And if there was nothing before, how do we understand that? That's a real question.
David Deutsch, thank you very much.
Bueno, la verdad es que me he quedado con ganas de más. Me ha parecido que se me ha quedado corto esto. Se me ha quedado corto David Deustch comentando un montón de cosas, ahora comentamos. Espera que aquí habéis... Ahí digo, ostras. Hola, palabra y fe. Hola, equipo. Feliz sábado, feliz sábado. Vamos a ir poniendo lo que habéis dicho. Eduardo César Garrido. No estoy de acuerdo. Si podemos acceder con interioridad y meditación a estados alterados de conciencia. Bueno, él no dice que no exista. Y sobre lo de poder acceder, hay evidencia empírica de papers científicos de primer nivel en la meditación budista ya, pero el poder acceder a esos estados de una forma, llamémoslo empírica, vamos, no sé. Yo ahí es lo que entiendo que es más complicado. No digo con eso que no se pueda acceder a un tipo de experiencia, qualia o información, ¿no? Pero entiendo lo que quiere decir David Deustch. Frescas tardes, dice Morcillece. Frescas, dice. Luego que tengo aquí el agua, si no. Y lo de Doménech, bueno, lo de Doménech, yo iba a comentarlo también. Y dice Eduardo, lo de Doménech solo muestra cambios en el espacio de qualia en base a cambios físicos del cerebro que experimenta la consciencia. Totalmente de acuerdo. A ver, al final Doménech lo que demuestra es que puedes interferir en la consciencia, no a la conciencia, que Doménech niega totalmente. Bueno, Doménech niega a la conciencia, la qualia lo niega todo. Somos tostadoras. Vamos a ver, me parece un reduccionismo simple. Yo a veces lo que pienso es cómo esta gente, bueno, David Deutsch, bueno, yo David Deustch, pero Deutsch, ¿cómo se pronuncia? A ver, que son genios. Como no caen en ese tipo de razonamientos como que está diciendo Eduardo, pero que vamos, que yo entiendo que es de perogrullo. Me gustaría poder preguntarles, pero claro, entiendo que, bueno. ¿Cómo encaja esta visión de Quantum Mechanics con lo que nos decía ayer de la literalidad del querido Philip? Bueno, Eduardo es que es un crack. Bueno, ahí él parte de una cosa que es, bueno, lo de la interpretación del tema cuántico y la interpretación de Everett del multiverso, ¿no? Él dice que no es una interpretación, que es la única interpretación. Entonces, la lateralidad en el tiempo, los efectos laterales en el tiempo, es decir, que puedas, bueno, tanto la naturaleza del tiempo como ir a otras realidades, bueno, encajaría con la visión, ¿no? No sé cómo explicarlo, evidentemente no tengo ese conocimiento, pero sí que lo que explica Deustch, David, sobre el tema del multiverso encajaría bastante con los efectos o laterales que explicaba ayer Philip K. Dick, ¿no? El conectar, ¿no? El que estemos conectados a esos mundos, ¿no? Y que haya como ciertas interferencias o solapamientos, ¿no? Es que ayer lo que... A mí, yo tengo una paranoia con lo de Philip K. Dick que es tremenda, ¿eh? Bueno, yo creo que si leyerais lo de... Bueno, es que es lo de la exégesis, es que, bueno, que son las cartas que le envía, lo que siente y tal. Bueno, pues es una experimentación de todo esto que se comenta, ¿no? Que es verdad que se debate poco porque entra dentro de casi de la locura, de cuestionar lo establecido, pero es lo que está comentando también aquí Eduardo, ¿no? Bueno, quizás es una locura pensar y ni exista lo que comenta Philip K. Dick de la lateralidad, pero si existe, encaja muy bien en lo que comenta David Deustch del multiverso y las interpretaciones de Everett, pero claro, todo esto está acogido, todo es una cuestión de meditarlo y pensarlo, tampoco podemos dogmatizar ni creerlo, ¿no? Como decía Philip K. Dick, voy a hablar de todo y nada y por lo tanto puede ser mentira, así que no, al revés, lo que voy a decir puede ser mentira y que no exista, por lo tanto voy a hablar de todo o nada. Luego cada cual saque sus propias conclusiones, yo me protejo, ¿no? Ricardo País dice, nuestros sentidos fueron evolucionando para sobrevivir. Normal que no podamos percibir todo lo físico que nos rodea. Claro, no podemos percibir la realidad última ni la realidad misma, sino una interpretación de la misma, ¿no? Bueno, una interpretación conjunta. Lo que pasa es que es una interpretación conjunta a nivel de conciencia, que es lo que comenta Philip K. Dick, ¿no? Porque claro, ahí no es individual. Es un campo de información que el consenso hace que eso sea esa realidad, ¿no? Es como si hubiera un algoritmo, un programa de consenso. Justo, Ricardo, un modelo debe optimizar el ser siempre simple y útil. El espacio de cualidad que percibimos es el indispensable para poder inferir una política de supervivencia en ese entorno. Es lo mismo que en el aprendizaje por refuerzo, las observaciones es su conjunto de las variables del entorno, no el entorno necesariamente, la red neuronal de la gente lo tendría más fácil. Sí, dándote la razón, Eduardo, pero una cosa sería los inputs a nivel físico de conciencia y otro lo que nosotros después procesamos, ¿no? Y lo que genera también después un output en forma de qualia o que después tiene su propio retorno de ese qualia en el proceso después que nosotros vamos a optimizar esa red, ¿no? Es decir, que al final es como algo que se va retroalimentando. Hay cosas que sí que se pueden afirmar del comportamiento de optimización, eso existe, ese aprendizaje, el algoritmo de aprendizaje por refuerzo. Además creo que fue en la Universidad de Madrid. Mira, creo que lo voy a buscar porque es una noticia que publiqué una vez. A ver, Madrid, Universidad, cerebro, creo que era dopamina, aprendizaje por refuerzo. Básicamente se demostró, ¿no?, que existe como... A ver... bueno, creo que es este. Bueno, creo que es este. Mira, lo voy a poner porque es muy curioso este artículo. Además, por una empresa, por una universidad española, la de Madrid. Si no conocéis en definitiva, que lo que estáis comentando tiene base, evidentemente, científica, ¿no? Lo que es el aprendizaje por refuerzo es un algoritmo que está en nuestro cerebro, vamos, para que se entienda así, en pocas palabras, ¿no? Pero bueno, tenéis esa investigación por parte de la UAM, la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, donde se investiga todo esto y no era exactamente este artículo, no lo sé si es, porque esa es la noticia, pero había un paper y había unas imágenes sobre el cerebro que estaban muy, muy, muy chulas. Es un estudio que está muy interesante. A ver, yo he publicado algunas imágenes, pero bueno, lo de siempre, publicas tantas cosas que la gente se queda con la mitad, ¿no? Pero bueno, buscadlo porque está. Voy a poneros la noticia ahí en el chat. Vale. Es muy curioso, ¿eh? Pero bueno, eso es distinto del qualia, ¿no? Lo que pasa es que el qualia en sí, con el nombre que le queramos poner, como dice Eduardo, a ver, sin ser algo demostrado científicamente, sí que nosotros lo experimentamos. Es decir, es que es negar la evidencia, ¿no? Es como el tema del yo, de la conciencia. A ver. No, cuando él habla como... No sé si te refieres a lo de la nada. A ver, la nada que no tiene que ver con lo de Cristian Castro. No quiero hacer nada, que es buenísimo, es buenísimo. Una pregunta, dice Rafael Navarro. ¿Cómo puede ser nada la IA y el mundo digital si maneja datos y se relaciona con nosotros? Entiendo que te refieres a la última pregunta que le hacen de la filosofía y ciencia de la nada, que él lo dice, ¿no? Hablar de la nada es hablar de algo y obviamente tiene... A ver, es como algo más complejo, ¿no? Claro, él ha hablado ahí de muchas cosas, fijaos que incluso habla de fuerzas. Bueno, el tema de la respuesta de la conciencia me ha parecido muy pobre respecto a Roger Penrose, ¿no? Cuando le han preguntado lo que opinaba Roger Penrose de la no computabilidad de la conciencia y él hace referencia a Gödel y él contesta de una forma, bueno, o yo no lo entiendo o no ha respondido. Para mí no ha respondido lo que quería decir. Se dice que somos creadores de realidad, sí. Luego cuando veamos el tema de la conciencia... Bueno, ahora vamos a ver otro vídeo que es si la conciencia es la realidad última. Y vamos a ponerlo ya, porque tampoco puede durar mucho. A ver un segundo. Vale, vamos a ponerlo. Pero bueno, me ha parecido interesante, ¿no? Me ha parecido interesante lo poco que ha contestado respecto a Roger Penrose y Gödel. Respecto a las reflexiones sobre la verdad última, sobre el tema del multiverso como única interpretación, eso está bien. Sobre la reflexión de qué hay, o la necesidad de saber qué hay antes del Big Bang, si no había nada, ¿no? Entonces, claro, hablemos de eso. ¿Cómo interpretamos eso? Porque, claro, es ir más allá, ¿no? Es hablar quizá de la trascendencia, de la nada, ¿no? Que es ese paso previo, ¿no? Pero, claro, poco tiempo. Tendríamos que poner más cosas de David Deustch. Lo pondremos este verano. Bueno, yo recomendaría una, bueno, no sé, la tengo que buscar, pero las primeras charlas, yo no sé, hay que escuchar siempre a la gente esta cuando son jóvenes, porque no tienen miedo a decir lo que piensan. Yo no, entiendo que ahora tampoco lo tendrá, ¿no? Pero hay una charla de David Deustch que es súper jovencito, no sé, tendrá 30 años, no sé, súper jovencito, ¿no? Y es brutal la charla esa. Me pareció, la busqué cuando vi Deustch, después de ver Deustch, y es como, what the fuck, un puto genio. Pero volvemos a lo mismo, vamos no estar de acuerdo en determinadas cosas con cosas que pueda decir, pero siempre con respeto. Y luego tenemos ahí todo ese mundo de vídeos, contenido, podemos seguirlo a él. Bueno, una base de contenido, papers, lo que queráis para conocer un poco y poder debatir sobre ello, pero evidentemente son mentes increíbles, ¿no? Pero bueno, entre ellos mismos, por ejemplo, Penrose y Deutsch, pues lo mismo ha pasado, ¿no? Que puede ser que nos... Vamos a poner este vídeo de Closer to Truth, que lo que nos hace pensar es si es la consciencia la realidad última, ¿no? Vamos a ver, o pensar o retener lo que acabamos de ver, que nos ha dicho David Deustch. Yo acostumbraba a decir David Deustch, bueno, da igual. Y vamos a ver qué nos dice este canal, que es de obligado, tenéis que seguirlo. Y creo que entrevista a varias personas reconocidas, entre ellas Donald Hoffman, y vamos a ver qué dice. Vamos a ver qué dice. Un segundo. Así ya está puesto.
To seek ultimate reality is to follow explanations until explanations end. And when explanations end, what remains? I'm looking for what remains. Physicists see fundamental laws. Believers see God. Some see consciousness. I'd love to see consciousness as ultimate reality. But isn't consciousness an unnatural choice? Isn't consciousness produced by brains? Aren't brains evolutionary accidents? Not so, say a few scientists. While brains facilitate human consciousness, cosmic consciousness generates brains and everything else. What motivates this coronation of consciousness as the cause of all reality, the progenitor of existence? Is consciousness ultimate reality? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I'd like consciousness to go beyond the physical world, but must I reject the reality of the physical world? Some scientists assert that consciousness causes everything. But how can scientists who study the physical world come to the extreme belief that the physical world is derived from consciousness? What evidence? What arguments? In the West, the notion that ultimate reality is consciousness is not mainstream. The scientists who so elevate consciousness are not mainstream. Could they shake up my thinking? Consciousness as ultimate reality is often associated with Eastern philosophy and religion, perhaps originating in ancient India. I begin with an Indian-American physician and teacher whose work is predicated on the primacy of consciousness, Deepak Chopra. Deepak, among scientists and philosophers who take consciousness seriously, many of them now say that consciousness is another fundamental part of the universe. Do you feel that consciousness is ultimate reality and everything else is derivative from consciousness?
The short answer is yes. Consciousness, defined as awareness, is ultimate reality. It's truth with a capital T. Now, scientists give labels to their experiences: electromagnetism, gravity, strong and weak interactions. Some of them are perceptual experiences. Gravity is a perceptual experience. I feel heavy, okay? It holds me here on this chair so I don't fly, which I can quantify in equations and all that. Electromagnetism is a word to describe certain behaviors. So everything that we call the four forces of nature, all mental, mathematical activities in consciousness, they are words we have created, and now we hold these words to represent fundamental truths. But all they are is perceptual and conceptual experiences in consciousness. There's no reality to any of that, okay? That's what science does. It creates a language, it creates a description of a conceptual or perceptual experience. So this is what reality is. Reality is none of that. What's a particle? It's a space-time event in consciousness. It's a happening in consciousness. There's nothing outside of consciousness.
But that's pure speculation, because those events are repeatable events. They are the kinds of things that people from different cultures, different walks of life, different experiences of all different kinds can agree upon.
Systems of thought that we agree in.
But everybody agrees.
Yeah, but you go to a religious ideology,
And on consciousness, everybody disagrees.
Okay, wait, because nobody has experienced it directly. Okay, that's why they disagree. They think of it as perception, cognition, all the things that are not consciousness, okay? Consciousness is not a system of thought. It is what gives rise to all systems of thought.
How then does consciousness create everything else?
Consciousness experiences itself as forms of consciousness. Color is a qualia, or a form of consciousness within consciousness. Sound is a form of consciousness within consciousness. There's no sound in the world. It's all vibration of molecules. In fact, there is no world. The world is a qualia gestalt, okay? And it's all forms of consciousness within consciousness that exist. Everything else is a perceptual illusion, including your own body. Doesn't exist.
Deepak is not shy and he does not equivocate. Only consciousness is real, all else is illusion. It's jarring to hear, radically at odds with our everyday perceptions, what we see, what we hear. Those are so real. Consciousness is so ethereal. Absurd? Perhaps not so. Here's the argument. How do we know those are so real? Only via consciousness. We have one window on reality, and consciousness is it. Is the claim all mysticism and philosophy? Any science involved? Since perception helps make the case for consciousness as ultimate reality, I turn to a cognitive scientist, an expert on visual perception, Donald Hoffman. Don, is consciousness ultimate reality, and how?
Alguien a seguir. Si no lo seguís, a Donald Hoffman es un, vamos, sí o sí tenéis que seguirlo.
What'd you get there?
Yes, I do take consciousness as being the fundamental reality. The burden on me then is first to say, what do I mean by consciousness? And I want a science of consciousness, not a hand wave. So the burden is on me to give a mathematically precise model of what I mean by consciousness. The goal is to take that precise mathematical model of consciousness and show, for example, that it precisely gives rise to our current physics. Then I can begin to try to show that it's at least consistent to take consciousness as fundamental and to say that the physical world is simply the contents of consciousness.
It doesn't seem conceivable that you can model consciousness with the same type of mathematical rigor that physicists can simulate and model the physics of subatomic particles.
It turns out it's quite easy to do it. If you think about it, we take for granted that we can give mathematical models of space and time, but if you just look at space and say, how do you assign numbers to points in the space? It was very, very bright people who figured out how to assign numbers to the physical world, and then all of a sudden this whole thing took off. Well, they've done the hard work. We can now do it with consciousness. So I can say, for example, in the case of color perception, let the set X be the set of John's color perceptions. I can quantify over his color perceptions. I can start talking about transformations of his color perceptions, and I can use all the tools of mathematics to do that. So I can say, here's a probability space of my conscious color experiences. Here's a probability space of the kinds of actions I decide to take, and I can then talk about maps among them. And I can get a mathematically precise model.
I can follow that. You are now generalizing John's color perception, but that doesn't represent John's color perception. That's a totally different category of stuff. Whereas the two masses in the gravitational equation those are the real things that you're talking about.
So in the case of Newton and F equals G m1 m2 over r squared, that equation, so you have the masses m1 and m2, those are just numbers.
Right.
If you write down those numbers, they won't be heavy.
Right.
You won't feel any mass to them.
Right.
So
there's a direct correspondence. You can understand that.
There is. Everybody in the field who does psychophysics uses mathematical models to represent the color experiences that they're measuring or the motion experiences and so forth.
And your claim is that that's the equivalent of assigning a number to the mass of an object.
That's exactly right. When you do it in physics...
Does anybody agree with you on that?
Well, I think that...
Nobody at this table does.
Well, in psychophysics, it's the standard approach.
I'm sure that's true, but that's answering a slightly different question.
Okay.
The question is it the same thing as assigning a number to two masses of body?
Oh, I think it's absolutely the same kind of thing in the sense that all you're doing with the mathematics is trying to write down a formal structure that you think mirrors the key features of the domain of interest.
Right.
So if I do a simulation of the weather, right, you don't expect to get wet. You don't need an umbrella to go check it out.
Right.
And if I give you a simulation of a mathematical model of consciousness, I'm not going to, create conscious being. There's no ghosts that are going to appear. So the mathematics is what it is. It's only useful to the extent that it actually allows us to predict our future experimental results.
Right.
And so that's the way I'm using it for consciousness. We're doing science.
I like Don's ambition, but even if conscious behaviors could be simulated, our personal, private, inner awareness seems radically distinct from non-sentient objects. I also cannot imagine how equations that describe mental perception of sight and sound can generate fundamental physics of particles and forces. What motivates these scientists to claim that consciousness is ultimate reality? I meet a medical doctor, a liver pathologist, who has come to believe that all things are conscious, nihil tis.
If you had asked me whether I believed a panpsychist position as opposed to an emergentist position about consciousness 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had an opinion. Now, I'm surprised to discover I do. What's meant by those is an emergentist position is that consciousness is something that emerges from the universe when it is sufficiently complex, like a human brain. The panpsychist position is that consciousness is something that pervades the universe side by side with matter energy, or a part of it, or maybe actually is the stuff out of which all of this arises. Let me select a metaphor that helps the panpsychist point of view. A radio is playing music. You can look at that and go, there must be a tiny little orchestra in there. Wow, they can play classical music and they can play rock. That's really cool. You open it up, there's no orchestra there. What the radio is doing is it's a transducer of the radio waves that we can hear. So the radio is taking this infinite, vastly information-rich thing and narrowing its scope so we can hear music. That could be how brains work. There's consciousness out there and the brain transduces that.
Isn't that a rather long jump that you've made?
No, I don't think so. And I think it's a pretty apt one, actually. I mean, that's pretty cool.
What are the pieces of evidence that you're using or that's drawing you in that direction?
Two sets. One, there is this sentience argument that I don't find any place where it's absent. I don't find where it wasn't here and now it's emerging. That makes me think it's not an emergentist thing.
You find a continuum.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one. Anything else?
Yeah. There is the experience I have from contemplative practice. I'm a Zen Buddhist student. I've been meditating for 25 years. But I have had experiences in meditation where my mind is not something that feels like it's coming from my brain. My experience of my mind extends beyond all boundaries, is infinite, is clear, is rich in light and information. Some people would call it pure awareness. Maybe that's a delusion produced by my brain, but that's not my experience of it. And that makes me think, okay, maybe I'm perceiving something fundamental about the world using my mind, about mind.
I myself have not had such contemplative experiences, but if I did, why would I assume that their origins were cosmic? How could I reject the skeptical argument that mystical feelings are all internal? Apparent dissociation from one's body may seem powerful personal evidence of non-physical realities. But such feelings are common in altered states of consciousness, however induced, drugs, alcohol, sleep deprivation, meditation. Such feelings can be explained by brain processes alone. But what cannot be explained is core conscious awareness. That's my conflict. I can reject scientific justifications for consciousness being ultimate reality, but not that consciousness itself is a great mystery. To solve the mysteries of consciousness, some scientists recruit the mysteries of quantum physics. I visit quantum popularizer Fred Alan Wolf. Though few quantum physicists take his speculations seriously, Fred is undaunted.
Fred, working particularly in quantum mechanics, do you see consciousness as something that's built up from the more fundamental things of brain function and then kind of emerging, or is consciousness something that is fundamental and irreducible in itself?
It's fundamental and irreducible. There's no way that you can build it up. It's just like having the proton or even the quark and trying to find everything based upon it being the fundamental when the quantum field is really the fundamental, which is an invisible thing. It's the same question. The things that consciousness does are the things that we call normal awareness of whatever it is. But it itself is difficult to contemplate as it itself because it's not a thing in of itself. It's not limited by space or time. We can see more of it, but not actually see it when we go down at the level of the quantum field, which is not a material thing.
It would seem that the burden of proof is on you because neuroscientists can show very strong correlations. Some would even go to causation between activities in the brain and our sensory, visual, auditory, motor. What you're talking about is kind of ethereal.
Well, it may be ethereal, but if you actually ask materialists how they can prove from whatever they look at that there's a willful intent operating in that body, if you can find their way of proving that, then I would agree with them, but they can't.
So one of the tests that you're using is willful intent. How do you have willful intent in a pure...
¿Dónde está la intención? ¿Qué es lo que falla? Lo mueve la conciencia, la voluntad, el propósito. ¿Dónde está? Eso nadie lo dice.
materialistic world?
You don't. You can't unless it's a machine. And we're not machines because we're shapers of possibilities into realities. That's what quantum physics predicts. It predicts that a mind or something, an observer, which is not material, shapes materiality.
So what are the implications of that? Is then willful intent, wherever it occurs, the critical factor in giving us this sense that consciousness is a real, independent, irreducible part of the world?
I think it is. And it is now, I think, of an interest if willful intent can be discovered in any materialistic way. But I don't think it can, because there's this process in quantum physics where we can't mathematize. We can't put it in a machine and make it work. We can't really see how it is that we shape possibilities, compact the wave function or collapse the wave function. We can't see that process in any kind of material way.
Is there anything else other than willful intent which gives robustness and actualizes this concept of consciousness?
The necessity of there being an abstract world prior to a material world. That if we try to explain everything in terms of a material world, we end up losing a lot of stuff that we can't explain. Whereas if we assume there is an abstract mental world, the material world suddenly becomes more explainable. I have to go back to the whole vision of the Platonic universe. It's there that I think we are being led. The reason I see that is that each of us has a sense of what's beyond the blur of our own particular way of seeing. In other words, we each have a Platonic ideal, and I believe that can only come because the Platonic world is the real world.
Fred starts with quantum physics, but then finds a deeper reality, rooted in consciousness or even in an abstract Platonic world. Quantum physics does indeed manifest strange traits, but building a world edifice on this shaky foundation seems at best premature. I might like reality to be remystified, which is why I should hear the critics. I meet a physicist known for his unconventional ideas, all based on his belief that the laws of physics, not consciousness, is ultimate reality, Frank Tipler. Some philosophers have taken that concept of consciousness and made it fundamental to the universe.
I think that's fundamentally misconceived. I think that all of reality, human beings, everything that goes to make us up, is fully subject to physical law. The human soul exists, and it's immaterial, but it's a computer program. You should think of the human mind, the human soul, the human consciousness as the result of a computer program being run on a wet computer, which is called the human brain. That we can actually quantify thoughts using the same language that we use for information theory. So there is nothing in the human consciousness that is outside the laws of physics and not fully capable of being described in complete detail by the laws of physics.
So that means that consciousness, our sense of soul, or a personal awareness is not only derivative
Somos software.
from the laws of physics, but in essence, it's no different than a chair, which is also derived from the laws of physics.
It's not quite like a chair. It's more like a word processing program. Now, it's real. It's immaterial, but it's still real. But what is that program? It's just a pattern on a CD. A blank CD, a CD, it's still the same atoms. What has changed, what has made a word processing program valuable, why you have to pay for it, is the change in the pattern of the atoms on the CD. But notice the pattern is immaterial. The pattern is rearranging the atoms rather than the atoms itself. The atoms are the matter. The pattern is truly immaterial. The soul is the same thing.
So you're using the term immaterial, not in the sense of non-physical, but in terms of something imposed on the matter or a pattern of the matter, but it is the matter itself. It's not non-physical.
Well, the laws of thermodynamics, the first two laws, the first one says conservation of energy. That applies to matter, to the material. We also have the second law of thermodynamics, which involves a concept called entropy. Entropy is the same sort of stuff as the soul. It is a law which governs pattern creation. So here you have, in the laws of physics, distinction between body and soul. The first law of thermodynamics concerns the body, concerns matter, concerns energy. The second law of thermodynamics controls information, controls pattern generation, controls and describes the spiritual world. The spiritual world is real, and it's there already in the physics.
Ya, claro.
To Frank,
Salto
consciousness
lógico.
is derivative. Only the laws of physics are fundamental. In fact, Frank almost deifies physics, as if God were another name for physical laws. I like his creativity and his courage, if not his conclusion. Conventional science offers no convincing evidence that consciousness is ultimate reality. If I'm still in this game, I need to go unconventional. Parapsychology claims that realities exist beyond the physical. I meet one of parapsychology's pioneers, Charles Tart. Charlie, as a psychologist who focuses on data, some unusual data to be sure, how do you view this question about the
irreducible nature of consciousness?
I view it through the lens of asking how useful is the question. What will different kinds of answers to the question lead you to do, and what might you learn from that? If you view it as fundamental, which is my preference, then you're going to ask questions about consciousness and do research on it that you wouldn't do otherwise. If you make consciousness fundamental, then it becomes very interesting to ask questions like, why don't we experience telepathic contact with each other all the time? Why do we feel separate? Is it simply because consciousness is so focused on a particular physical body and brain that it's ignoring all the other telepathic impressions?
And can we make progress on that? Because if we can't, then maybe consciousness is not fundamental and it is reducible to brain function alone. If consciousness can be something other than the brain and still not be fundamental, it could be derived from something else.
Then let's find out what that is.
Is that possible in principle? Because maybe if we're dealing in the physical world of physical experiments and data, that in principle, those kinds of things, if they exist, are not susceptible to the kinds of observations that we make in the physical world.
When you ask an ultimate question like that, Robert, I'm reminded of something that John Lilly once put very nicely. Something like, in the realm of the mind, what one believes to be true tends to become true. So the moral of all that is be careful what you believe. If you believe in certain kind of limits, your mind may create those limits for you. If you don't, it may not. Try it both ways and see what happens.
Well, I would put that almost in reverse, that because I have a desire for consciousness to be fundamental, I'm going to spend more time and think about it and talk about it. Maybe I'm just fooling myself.
Maybe, but what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is to face reality and to look at the scientific data, and if the scientific data doesn't support it, put your efforts into things that make sense and not into nonsense.
I'm an experimentalist, I'm a pragmatist. I say try different approaches and see what comes of them and see where it takes you. If you go down some dead ends, that's fine, you learn from the dead ends. If you go to interesting new places, wonderful.
Some say that consciousness doesn't exist, it is illusion. Others that consciousness is the only thing that exists, it is ultimate reality. Here is a decision tree of questions. Is consciousness entirely the product of physical brain? If yes, stop. Consciousness has no cosmic significance. If no, ask, is consciousness reducible to or explainable by something more fundamental? If yes, seek what's more fundamental, perhaps God or something like God. If no, ask, is consciousness the only non-reducible thing? If yes, then consciousness is ultimate reality. If no, then consciousness shares ultimate reality, perhaps with the laws of physics. What if consciousness were ultimate reality? It would not be a person in the sense of a personal God. No intent, no will, no purpose. Would pure awareness even make sense? There could be enduring principles. Our human consciousness could be somehow derived from this cosmic consciousness, and when we die, somehow return back to it. Such cycles or forms of reincarnation typify Eastern religions. I guess it'd be better than stark physicalism, though for me, not much better. I'd hope something else is closer to truth.
Bueno, tremendo vídeo. Vamos a ver lo que decís aquí por el chat y nos vamos. Vamos a la playa. Dice Eduardo, pensar en el alma como un patrón estadístico complejo te lleva al emergentismo. Claro. ¿Cómo de complejo es el patrón ese entonces? ¿Cuál vale y cuál no? Y lo más importante, ¿por qué existe si es más complejo? Bueno, pero es una forma también de abordarlo, como dice Donald Huffman, ¿no? Que al final, no sé si tienes otra posibilidad de abordarlo de una forma científica, ¿no? No, que no seas capaz de hacer progreso en algo no implica que eso no exista. Eso es una falacia, sí, pero sirve a la parte contraria, ¿no? Para, bueno, como ha dicho este último parapsicólogo, pues ¿qué remedio? Al final uno tiene que emprender el camino y nadie te garantiza el éxito porque, claro, todo el cientificismo lo que te lleva es a no avanzar en ese camino. Y como bien dices tú, que algo lo niegue la ciencia o no lo pueda demostrar no significa que no exista. Y si existe y porque tú lo experimentas, deberíamos poder caminar, preguntarnos y avanzar, ¿no? Quizá nunca tengamos las respuestas, pero sí elegir qué determinadas preguntas nos hacemos y cuáles no, puedan determinar una realidad u otra. Y eso implica a nivel de lo que es el análisis de la conciencia, pero también el análisis de toda esta nueva era de inteligencia artificial en el que no tendremos todas las respuestas y sí podremos elegir las preguntas. Y esta reflexión que acabo de hacer me parece muy brillante. Como no tengo abuela, me lo digo yo solo. Así que, amigos, tengo ganas de playa. Yo creo que ha sido un programa muy interesante, tanto con David Deustch, que es una figura que no habíamos tenido aquí, pero que es alguien que tenéis que seguir, con ese libro de La fábrica de la realidad que inspiró la serie Devs, y luego ese canal Closer to Truth, uno de los primeros vídeos donde debatían sobre conciencia y realidad última con varios enfoques distintos, bastante interesantes que hay que tener en cuenta. Y en definitiva, xHUB.AI, en verano, con calor, con playa o sin ella, lo que propone es un espacio de pensamiento crítico. No... Me ha hecho mucha gracia el comentario que me han puesto en el Discord, ¿no? Que dice que ha tenido que tomar valerianas cuando ha escuchado el programa, la entrevista esa famosa. Bueno, espero que no tengáis que tomar valeriana escuchando los programas de xHUB.AI, sino al revés, ¿no? Que eso os expanda la mente y la conciencia. Bueno, amigos, un abrazo, espero que lo hayáis disfrutado. Yo me lo he pasado muy bien. Ha sido un ratito agradable. Si no pasa nada, mañana no sé qué exactamente qué programa elegiré, pero bueno, algo interesante y light, por ser domingo, y que pasemos un ratito agradable juntos. ¿Vale? Bueno, nos vemos a la próxima.